This podcast is brought to you by Flex 7 from TenCate Protective Fabrics. Flexible, comfortable, and powered with the strength of enforced technology. Flex 7 outer shell fabric is made to move. To learn more, visit tencatefabrics.com/Flex 7.
For all your medication and narcotic tracking needs, check out the LogRX app, created by career fire and EMS professionals. That's LogRX.com.
Taking It to the Streets is all about advancing firefighter safety and operational integrity for the fire service. And now, the latest edition of Taking It to the Streets with your host, Christopher Naum.
Welcome to this edition of Buildings on Fire's Taking It to the Streets. I'm your host, Christopher Naum. On your street, in your city, across the country, and around the world, Taking It to the Streets is all about firefighter safety, advancing operational excellence, and learning more about the built environment as it applies to our dynamic fireground. Our episode on this edition of Taking It to the Streets is really just a slight introduction on a topical area that is integrated into much of what we continue to talk about in terms of our fireground modeling, our building sciences integration, as it more importantly relates to the dynamic fireground that we are encountering certainly over the last couple of years, and certainly in this decade of time. It's interesting to note that recently some insights and some conversations came about regarding some aspects of either enhancements or deficiencies dealing with the fireground search process and methodologies and practices and proficiencies. And certainly when we talk about the built environment and we talk about our structures and our buildings, certainly that's first and foremost when we address that to the primary mission that we have regarding the search and or rescue or the removal of civilians that may be in distress, incapacitated, or otherwise not having the ability to self-extricate out of that environment based upon the conditions that they are encountering and the fire conditions that are affecting that occupancy and that structure. Our episode on this edition is focusing in on three distinctive topical areas that we've been talking about for well over 20 years. We introduced these concepts in the early part of the 2000s, around the 2005 era, when we actually presented, and in those early days of blogging, for better words, and we were certainly one of the leaders out there and the pioneers with a couple of other different platforms at the time, but we've been podcasting since the latter part of the early 2000s, and we continue to bring forward relevant, timely information here, certainly on Fire Engineering BlogTalk Radio, on our phenomenal platform here on fireengineering.com, and again, continuing to bring forward our discussions dealing with the built environment. That is clearly our main focus and continues to be the predominant issue affecting fireground operations. Our topic is really an introduction. It's not really a conversation. Obviously, we don't have the ability to get into some dialogue here and get into some of the back and forth conversation. But I wanted to take a little bit of time on this episode and really just a short segment, unlike our normal, rather lengthy topical areas. But on this edition, I wanted to talk a little bit about fireground performance. And that fireground performance relates back to three distinctive factors that are integrated, and they're integrated in everything we do. It's interesting to note that there are others, authors and podcasters and webcasters and instructors and so forth, that are starting to understand and grasp the concept of one particular aspect of fireground performance that, again, we have been discussing for well over 20 years. And we have been integrating that more into our building facts model, our first arriving construction tactics and safety. It is integral to today, not only to today's operations, but has always been integral in past Fireground operations. When we talk about yesterday's Fireground, and we talk about either the distinct similarities or the distinct differences between yesterday's Fireground and today's Fireground. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we get into the conversation. So unlike our normal content where we've had the opportunity to spend sometimes over 60 or 90 minutes or more into some of our topical areas, our segment here on this episode is really going to be much more succinct, a little bit more focused. I want to talk a little bit about and introduce you to, and further along this conversation regarding Fireground operations, dealing with Fireground Performance. And that Fireground Performance revolves around 3 distinct integrated items. For many of you that have been following our programs and following our podcasts and webcasts over the many years, hopefully you already have an idea of what that topic or what those 3 particular pieces are. But I'm going to get into those a little bit more in detail. I've got some notes that I've got here that we are queuing in place to allow us to have, again, a more direct level of insight. Again, a couple of things coming. FDIC notifications recently went out, and those that have been selected, I think it's safe to say that FDIC, the entire advisory board, and FDIC advisory committee have put together a phenomenal cadre of instructors and topical areas. I'm looking forward to returning again to FDIC here in 2025 with a classroom program, and we'll talk a bit more about that topic in the upcoming couple of weeks ahead, or certainly later in this quarter. One of the things that I have talked a lot about when we talk about yesterday's Fireground and its relationship to today's Fireground, and I'm going to segue this into some conversation here about those 3 integrated aspects. Fireground Performance is so critical on today's dynamic Fireground due to a variety of different factors. We talk about building-related issues, we talk about fire dynamics, and we talk about the distinctive application dealing with our resources. And that resources has everything to do with the company and the personnel that, again, comprise and are able to function and operate on that Fireground based upon the adequacies or limitations of Fireground resources and the timeliness of those resources. So one of the things when we talk about Buildings on Fire and we talk about yesterday's Fireground, it's safe to say that yesterday's Fireground certainly had very common, identifiable building construction and methods of construction. Buildings behaved, and Tom Brennan, the late Tom Brennan, used to talk a lot about allowing the building to behave. And he used to provide some analogies between what one would want to do in the early stages upon arrival, the timeliness of arrival, and based upon company assignments, the severity, the urgency, and the growth of a particular evolving incident. And it's certainly important to note that we have to show up prepared and move forward in a very deliberate and timely manner. But he also would talk about, especially dealing with a ladder company working in the borough of Brooklyn during the war years, when, again, there were a lot of factors affecting survivability and other related conditions of civilians in common buildings that were pretty consistent within the various neighborhoods and areas of, whether it be the area of Brooklyn or certainly Queens or the Bronx or Manhattan. But certainly when we talk about the uniqueness and consistencies that were present during the war years of the 1970s and early 80s in the borough of Brooklyn, it's safe to say that when Chief Brennan talked about, especially in the context of him as a captain on a ladder company, he would reiterate and reinforce the concept of let the building behave, let the building do its thing, let the building's performance conditions, those things that were common to the types of structures, the types of occupancies, the conditions of the buildings, the severity and the magnitude of the fire conditions that were typically being encountered, and the challenges that needed to be overcome, and the types of situations that companies upon their arrival, based upon the sequence of arrival, meaning first due, second due, and the company type, whether it be an engine company, ladder company, or rescue or support company units, had very distinct, very deliberate activities and assignments based upon the sequence of operations, based upon the building type, based upon fire severity, and recognizing what the size up would potentially indicate, suggest, or what they recognize just based upon experience on some of those evolving factors of what needed to be done, when it needed to be done, and how it needed to be done. And it goes back to this concept of letting the building behave. And it was company level determined when all he said was, don't be ineffective in your operations, but let certain things play out in the sequence of the arrival time that normally were highly expected, projected, and fairly reliant on how those buildings existed in that era, in that particular area, and what they were normally encountering. Again, that's the consistencies of the first due, second due response areas in a particular community, unlike many of yours, that they knew what to expect. They clearly, based upon the frequency and the reliability of what could occur, they primarily indicated that, and Brennan would indicate that, let the building behave, let the flashover occur, let the building compromise or failure occur, so that it would not affect company integrity, not affect the ability for the team, for the company to deploy and carry out and conduct the important tasks that were so critical during that sequence of arrival. So it's a very critical concept. And if you've never heard of that, again, Chief Brennan, or Captain Brennan at the time, working as a ladder company officer in the borough of Brooklyn in that war years when time was such a critical element, that he would profess and expect that, again, personnel at that company level would just be aware of some of the inherent characteristics in certain types of buildings based upon certain types of fire conditions that let the building behave, and not to become part of that potential problem. And just bear that in mind, because that's going to have some context a little bit further in our further discussion here. So again, let the building behave. Rules of firefighting were pretty simple operation, tactics, direct engagement. Prescriptive construction-based tactics were pretty consistent. And we, for the most part, default upon construction-based tactics in much of what we do currently across the United States. And again, I've witnessed, been able to have some robust conversations at the company, battalion, divisional, and sometimes the municipality level with both urban and metro-sized organizations, as well as small rural and suburban departments that may be running on a smaller call volume, but may still have some significant hazards associated with building and occupancy types and building stock and era and vintage of structures, occupancies, conditions, and certainly the types of civilians and the building users that are utilizing, occupying, and functioning within the built environment. Prescriptive construction-based tactics is an important concept to recognize and be able to internalize. Fire dynamics matched fire suppression, and that's another leading item here that's going to get into our conversation. Fire dynamics matched fire suppression efforts. Fire dynamics also were pretty consistent back in the day, yesterday's Fireground, when we would talk about what we would normally be encountering upon arrival, what we would normally expect to encounter as fire conditions would evolve and potentially grow based upon severity and magnitude, based upon the fire conditions that were present, the fire load, primarily when we talked about BTUs per square foot. There were certain contexts of square footages, building type, certain construction, and the commonality of certain types of fire dynamics that were encountered within those types of contents. So why else did we not have what was very common back in the day, referencing to room and contents, or small isolated types of fires, room and contents, and how they would evolve from room and contents to structural fires, and then certainly to all hands or larger multiple alarm fires that required more resources and demanded much more of engagement, and with a lot of other challenges affecting companies during that particular point in time. Process models, methods and methodologies and practices pretty much aligned. So again, when we talk about fire dynamics and we talk about fire dynamics matching fire suppression, process models and methodologies and our practices, it was pretty consistent. Time was not an issue. Buildings allowed us to do our jobs. Yesterday's Fireground also, again, when we talk about some of the other factors, personnel knew and did their jobs, proficiency, discipline, rigor, mission above all, clear expectations, simple technology, manual, physical, brute force, and determination. We had time. We had people. We could mess up and still live. We could not know our job and still be part of the team, and we got away with it. It was accepted. We were slow to change. Change was discussed, debated, vetted, accepted, and then implemented. And we embraced tradition while we were making it. And those are pretty consistent notes here, that when we talk about methodologies and processes and models, talking about Buildings on Fire, yesterday's Fireground, when we talk about the structural Fireground conditions. Today's Fireground, building anatomy issues, we talk about the variations of construction, operation, tactics, engagements were all over the board. We're starting to see some consistencies there. Civilian life safety continues to be paramount, and there's a lot of conversations revolving around the lecture circuit nationally, major conferences, and certainly at kitchen tables across the United States, in firehouses, across, again, the landscape of our communities. And again, that's a good thing when we talk about the importance of civilian life safety, and again, honing and developing skill sets. And again, bear that particular little bullet in mind when we talk about the leading pieces here that are so important. We talk about Fireground Performance. Fireground Performance, three distinctive elements here that are part of this conversation. Occupancy use and occupancy risk. We are moving further away. It's something that we have been advocating and discussing for almost 15 years now. When we talk about occupancy use and an occupancy risk, not all residential occupancies have the same level of risk. Not all commercial buildings, any building for that matter, whatever the building and occupancy type, based on certain parameters that are predictable. Again, we talk about performance. All buildings are predictable in terms of how they potentially may perform on the Fireground if we understand some of the parameters and elements that go in them when we talk about functional and operational and characteristics that are inherent, things that, again, may have been added to an older building, or things that are inherent in our newer types of structures. So again, bear that in mind also. The predictability of building performance, the POP, is nothing new to this show and to our conversation and dialogue. We have been talking about predictability performance again for going on over 20 years. It is first and foremost, as I mentioned again, all buildings are predictable if we understand the parameters that affect the manner in which the building is constructed, aspects dealing with era and vintage, considerations dealing with building systems, the 5 fundamental domains that we'll get into here again to reinforce or reacquaint you to that if you have not heard about those. But again, it's predictability. It's about the fire load. It's about the rate of heat release. We talk about heat release rate, or the rate of heat release. It's so important. We talk about the conversations that we now are having, going back to 2005, almost 20 years, 21 years actually, when we are 19 years when we discussed some of the issues dealing with reacquainting ourselves with fire dynamics. And again, that is an important little attribute here that we're going to tie back in again. The technical variables, then we talk about engineering, we talk about architecture, we talk about construction and materials engineering and in building sciences, and certainly the variations of cost that go into a building. But again, we talk about predictability of the building, predictability on the Fireground, and the relationship of fire dynamics. And again, some of these things are going to be connected here. We talk about a more adaptive perspective versus a prescriptive perspective on fireground operations based upon these particular variables. And again, important to note, the need for an integrated process, both in terms of the models, the methodologies, and the practices, and that's what we have been advocating and very diligently presenting nationally and internationally, but certainly on the national level across here, the United States and into the North Americas, talking about the first arriving construction, tactics, and safety. And we're going to lead into this here in a moment. And again, the aspects of time compression, tactical windows, the limitations of tactical windows that affect operations, and then again, performance demands. And those performance demands are associated with three distinctive pieces. I mentioned, again, our title here for our show is talking about Fireground Performance, and as a lead into this conversation that we have talked about in other episodes, certainly over the last immediacy of the last couple of years of our archived episodes here on fireengineering.com, but performance demands dealing with performance of the building, performance of the compartment, and performance of the company. Human performance, or the HU component that is so critical and are so integrated into the fireground. Couple of things here. We've made mention of this in the past, and I'm going to quote these. So again, the following is this: has the fireground changed? Each year, a sizable percentage of the numbers of firefighters killed is the result of structural collapse. There are cases on record where the deaths from collapse were a direct result of faulty size up by officers because of their lack of knowledge of building construction, fire behavior, and the rate of water application needed. And one would think, again, if I give you a moment to reflect upon that, we talk about, again, faulty size up. We talk about the lack of knowledge of building construction, fire behavior, water application, and it goes a little bit further beyond that. But those three distinctive elements are pretty consistent. We talk about the conversations, the dialogues, the debates that are occurring certainly in today's fire service. But Chief Lloyd Lehman in 1951 presented that quote in his book on firefighting tactics. So again, we go all the way back to 1951. Here we are almost 70 plus years later, 75 years later, and we're having the same conversations. Another quote here that I think it's worthy of reiterating again, and I'll say this, the following is a quote: if you don't fully understand how a building truly performs or reacts under fire conditions and the variables that can influence its stability, degradation, the movement of fire, the products of combustion, and the resource requirements for fire suppression in terms of staffing, apparatus, and required fire flows, then you will be functioning and operating in a reactionary manner. This places higher risk to your personnel and lessens the likelihood for effective, efficient, and safe operations. You're just not doing your job effectively, and you're at risk. These risks can equate into insurmountable operational challenges. It could lead to adverse incident outcomes. Someone could get hurt. Someone could die. It's that simple. It's that obvious. Those were the words of Chief Anthony Aiellos, who is the chief of the Hackensack, New Jersey Fire Department, who on his watch lost 5 firefighters in July of 1988 at the Hackensack Ford fire. Those words reiterate, and again, when we take a look at the words of Chief Aiellos that were captured obscurely in a local newspaper in New Jersey on one of the anniversaries of the Hackensack Ford fire, as well as Chief Lloyd Lehman's words that were born and that are profoundly embedded in the firefighting book on tactics from 1951. Distinctive words that have very clear delineations and clear alignments. We talk about fire behavior. We talk about the building. We talk about personnel. We talk about suppression. We talk about operations. These all distinctively distill down to 3 distinctive elements. The 3 distinctive things. When you take a look at the big global elements, eventually you can distill and filter them down to 3 aspects that are fundamental to the predictability of building performance and to the predictability of fireground operations on today's fireground. One of the primary tenets of operations that I just want to make mention of, and I think if my memory serves me well, we talked about these tenets of operations maybe early 2023 in one of our episodes, or the latter part of 2022. And I will have to go back and I'll do some posting online to make some referencing back to some of those archived programs. But again, I would encourage you as a listener who's listening in on the current programs, but there is such a distinctive array of quality programs that are available in the archives on fireengineering.com to go back. I mean, again, go back numerous years of time with extraordinary and timely programs that are as relevant today as they were back when they were first published. And they continue to be part of our conversation when we talk about how to put all of these things together, how to connect the dots. When we talk about the challenges of the buildings, the challenges of the fire conditions, and the uniqueness when we talk about the conditions that we are encountering in both old or new buildings in a variety of occupancy types, with the type of staffing levels that each and every one of us has, which is a variable. And that is so important to recognize. One of the variables that is distinctively different than in yesterday's fireground and yesterday's operations. We're talking about yesterday's fires, yesterday's fireground, is the aspect of the availability, consistent availability of resources, of personnel that comprise our companies. It's safe to say that in a different era of time, going back into the 70s and 80s, we started seeing the situation starting to change as we got into the mid 1990s, and certainly by the early 2000s, all the way till current. We still have concerns and a lot of debate and conversation and robust debate with municipalities and those that oversee our financial budgets. From a fire department standpoint, we talk about staffing, the adequacy of staff. We can take a look at NFPA 1710, NFPA 1720, other related to NFPA standards that, again, reflect and provide very distinctive guidance and requirements as they relate to staffing that relate back to fireground operations. And again, performance during operations in terms of our buildings on fire. Some of the primary tenets of operations, I'm going to give you a few quick bullets here. RIT, the concept of RIT is, again, another main component of our building facts model for surviving construction tactical safety. The concept of RIT regarding resiliency or resistance, integrity, and time. There is building RIT. There is also company level RIT. And again, just keep that thought sort of on your notes or in the front of your mind. There is this aspect of performance during operations of the building. That building performance relates back to resiliency, integrity, over time. The delta time is a critical factor. And there's also this aspect of human performance at the company level, or the box alarm, which comprises our resources for a given alarm assignment, both that's on scene or those resources that may be forthcoming based upon greater alarms. But it's also, again, the aspects of resiliency and integrity over time of the building, but it's also resiliency, integrity over the elapse of time for the company, for the team, for the individual. So again, remember that a little bit. The predictability of and probability of building performance is a primary tenet. Predictable and probability that are all born out of understanding fully and comprehending and being able to apply, utilizing critical thinking, which is, again, a human performance element here. The conditions of what we know about that building, what we can predict, but it's certainly born out of skill set, proficiencies that drive a safety conscious work environment in a highly proficient and efficient fire service organization, whether it be at the company, at the station, or certainly at the divisional, battalion divisional, or the departmental level. Understanding the aspects of fire dynamics and also being critical to how we've been conditioned, our conditioned tactical reflex, or CTR, and how that also influences our performance on the fire ground. Understanding the concept of severity, urgency, and growth relative to fire dynamics. We'll explain a little bit more about the relationship here of fire dynamics to the three elements here of our building. The aspects of high risk, high consequence conditions that affect the building's performance, affect the fireground performance, they affect the company performance, human performance, high risk, high consequence, and what we call error likely situations that may occur. There's also this concept, although we won't get into greater detail here on this episode, but we introduced the concept of MELT, M-E-L-T, most error likely tactic. Most error likely tactic, that again relates back to human performance at the company level. It also relates back to misreading the fire, misreading the compartment, misreading the fire dynamics within the building, which affects fireground performance. So again, it goes back to the individual, goes back to the company, also goes back to the integrated aspects of fireground. And again, the need for a more adaptive fireground management model. When we take a look at the considerations for a conditioned tactical response and what we call a tactical edge, there are 5 different elements here that have some correlations. I'm just going to give you them real quickly here. Recognition, prime decision making, or what's currently referred to as naturalistic decision making. The second element deals with experience. The third element deals with awareness. Fourth element deals with knowledge, and the fifth element deals with science and technology. The experience, awareness, and knowledge all go back to the relevancy and are relevant to the 3 pieces that we have been sort of leading up to here in terms of our conversation of how that relates back to fireground performance. The most relevant elements when we talk about the 3 correlating conditions, when we talk about fireground performance, first and foremost relate to the building. They relate back to the compartment and fire. And the third element that are integrated in everything that we do here on today's fireground is the company. 3 distinctive integrated elements that we first introduced to the American Fire Service in the early 2000s, talking about the correlation and the integration of building, compartment, and company. And that's where we're going with our conversation here of fireground performance. There are 3 distinctive elements of the building, the fire, and the company. They lead back to the considerations of naturalistic decision-making, RPDM, experience levels that are gained out of fireground operations. It's our increased awareness. It's our knowledge, or KSAs, knowledge, skills, and abilities that directly fall under the considerations for human performance. And then that 5th item that all leads to this highly suggested consideration for an adaptive fireground management model. We have to be much more adaptive based upon the conditions we are encountering on today's fireground relative to fireground performance based upon 3 variables: the variables of the building, the variables of the company, of the fire conditions within the compartment, and the variables of the company. Keep that in mind. And they all lead to the adaptive fireground management model. We cannot be relying on a prescriptive-based and construction-based tactical model. We have to have considerations for and be adaptable based upon 3 factors that have some consistencies, but also have some variables on today's fireground. So, again, when we get back into conversations, we talk about the evolving built environment, the demanding fireground in terms of today's fireground, and the aspects of fireground performance. And fireground performance, or performance-driven operations, when we talk about the built environment is developing faster with greater complexity, with greater hazards and greater risks to firefighters than the tactical models that are currently being suggested or being presented, or defaulting back to a different methodology and practice that may not be entirely appropriate for today's fireground, today's built environment, today's fire conditions that we are encountering. That goes back to that fifth element that I just mentioned a moment ago, science and technology, the insights that we are gaining from science and R&D, specifically to fire dynamics and fire behavior. So again, three distinctive pieces: the building, the compartment, and the company. And we'll explain a little bit further here in a moment how they correlate, but it goes back to distinctively the built environment is developing faster with greater complexity, greater hazards, and greater risks to firefighters, to companies, to our personnel than the tactical models are providing for, in terms of how we are deploying and how we're assessing, how we're sizing up, and this false sense of having the availability of time, and that building construction type tactics are going to provide the methods and the process for us to conduct ourselves. And it certainly goes back to this aspect of fire and building literacy. It goes back to this consideration for the operational modeling, having adaptiveness, utilizing critical thinking that falls under human performance, conservative bias, self-regulating discipline, resiliency, and yes, at the end of the day, brute force, sheer determination, being able to clearly understand variables and have an appreciation of how they potentially may play out during the conduct of operations within those tactical windows that may sometimes be very limiting based upon the building, based upon the fire conditions, or maybe that may have a far greater degree of latitude regarding those variables based upon building, based upon compartment, and based upon company. So it's an important concept to recognize, important concept to start moving forward here. And again, hopefully we're going to allow you to maybe connect some dots. And if this is the first time you're hearing this, there's a lot more to be said about this. If you are a consistent follower of our programs, as well as a follower of some of the other programs that are out there, the podcast, webcasts, things that are being presented at regional and national conferences, the things that are being presented at FDIC, there is a consistent thread that is starting to weave through some of the conversations that we're having. And it's very encouraging to see some of the original concepts that were formulated, again, a number of years back, as they related specifically to one of era and vintage, when we talked about era and vintage as late as 1999 and introduced that online in the early 2000s. We brought forward this concept that was specifically rooted in engineering and architecture and firefighting, the concept of era and vintage that were directly related back to how buildings were built in certain periods of time that revolve around the 5 fundamental aspects of our buildings that are also part of this first arriving construction, tactics, and safety. So what does this all mean? Well, there's considerations when we talk about the building, the compartment, and the company. And I want to give you a little bit of insights that relate back to where this comes from. So if you were to ask an individual that's out there that's talking a little bit about any one of these 3 categories, they would certainly be potentially hard pressed to give you some insights on why, what's this correlation? Why building, compartment, and company? And the genesis of this is pretty inherent and pretty fundamental, and it's also pretty consistent with some of my background when we started connecting these dots and materializing through a variety of other programs. But when we talk about this first arriving, the building facts model, and the relationship back to performance, there are 3 distinctive relationships to performance: the building, it's the compartment, and it's the company. These 3 critical pieces of the building having a clear and decisive level of knowledge that is born out of knowledge, skills, and abilities, education, experience, truly understanding the building, understanding construction, understanding the sciences of different elements that went into these buildings in different era of time, being able to recognize, to comprehend, and to be able to critically think and apply what that means under fireground conditions and those variables. The compartment has everything to do with the fire. We used to talk about back in the day, room and contents. It had everything to do with a compartment fire, where we were going. And again, bear that in mind here in a moment. And who's fighting our operations on the fireground. When we talk about resources, it has everything to do with that company. But also bear in mind that company variables, both in terms of staffing as well as capabilities, knowledge, skills, and abilities, may provide an increased level of human performance that creates a different level of variables, or it lessens those levels of variables, or it may increase the level of risk based upon engagement, disengagement, and how we are operating within those tactical windows on the fireground. So when we talk about the building, it has everything to do with predictability performance. We talk about the compartment and the fire conditions that are located in a compartment that very well may, all fires start in some compartment, whether that be a compartment is occupied or whether that compartment is a concealed space or a void. But typically when we are referring to the compartment, we're talking about the spaces within a structure, however large or small, that have characteristics. They have volume, they have square footages. There are considerations based upon the physical characteristics that are inherent, designed, or altered of that compartment in that building. All buildings have singular or multiple compartments. That is important to note. And all compartments have a variable of RIT, resiliency, integrity, that has consideration over the delta of time, that are based upon and influenced by severity, urgency, and growth of the fire originating in that compartment. And then we talk about the company, we talk about knowledge, skills, and abilities. We talk about human performance. How is that individual that's part of a team, that's part of the company, how are they conditioned, and what type of conditioned tactical reflexes do they employ? Or have they been developed that either have consistencies or inconsistencies that are part of that company on that particular shift at that particular time, that may be different or may be similar based upon other companies and units within the battalion, in the district, within the department, or within the region. So clearly bear that in mind. And then lastly, the other aspect there deals with the considerations of time. Delta time on today's fireground as it relates to all three of those. Delta time, the elapse of time regarding the building, the elapse of time regarding the compartment, fire severity, fire growth, and the aspects of elapsed time regarding the company. Human performance. If I've got the A-team company, it's comprised of 4 individuals who have a high degree of mental and physical capabilities. Their performance, their human performance, will be substantially different than a company that may have variables or other factors that, again, may create some considerations that relate back to their performance, that will manifest and present themselves in the performance of that company based upon their assignments, based upon their area of operation. So let me give you quickly here the correlations. What is this relationship here of first arriving, construction, tactics, and safety that we have been talking about in this episode, and that really is a main formulation of our fireground modeling concepts here. So think about this: construction, tactics, and safety. We talked about building, we talk about compartment, we talk about the company. So when we talk about construction, we talk about building performance. All buildings have singular or multiple compartments. Compartments have a variety of characteristics. Again, that compartment has square footages, has volumes, it may have connectivity. What's open, what's closed, how does that connect with something vertically, horizontally within that particular space? Compartments have a degree of resiliency, meaning that fire can be contained within that particular compartment over an elapsed period of time that either may help or degrade and work against us. So bear in mind, construction, and just as this is at the most basic of considerations, building performance, compartment, and the resiliency. When we talk about tactics, we talk about the aspects of relationship of again, first arriving, construction, tactic, and safety. We have building construction, we have building performance, we have occupancy types, we have different era and vintage of buildings, we have different materials, methods of materials of construction, different characteristics that are inherent, building anatomy, and so forth. But it's everything to do with building performance and those types of compartments and their degree of resiliency. When we talk about compartments, the compartment is where we go. As a company, fire is normally located in some type of singular or multiple compartments, or maybe extending into other compartments of varying sizes, complexity, orientation, resiliency, integrity, and so forth. So the compartment is where the fire is located. The fire is where companies are deployed to, again, identify the seat of the fire. But again, the compartment, fire location, companies, and we get into engagement. That engagement is nothing more than whatever type of strategy or whatever type of tactics we are employing at the task level. So compartment, when we talk about on the bigger piece, tactics, we talk about the compartment, we talk about fire, we talk about the company, and we talk about engagement. That is the aspects of our tactics. When we talk about the third item of safety, it has everything to do with the company. That company, and this is introducing something that, again, we have been talking about for a while now, introducing into the American Fire Service the concept of human performance. Human performance is most closely related to some of the things that we talked about back in the 1980s, early 1990s with crew resource management. Crew resource management, or CRM, had everything to do with this concept of human performance as it relates back to accountability, safety conscious work environment, continuous learning, error likely situations, and how to override or how to overcome the most error likely situations, or employing or considering or having consideration for or misreading the building, misreading the fireground, misreading the building, misreading the fire, misreading the company. Those are three things. There are four reads on the fireground: reading the fireground, reading the building, reading the compartment, and reading the companies. We introduced that concept again to the American Fire Service as part of our predictability performance model. But when we talk about the safety element, very broad-based, it has everything to do with the company's capabilities. What's my staffing level? What's the capabilities of my personnel? What's the degree of resources? And ultimately, what is the degree of risk? So again, think of it in this context. I could have a company that's staffed with 4 individuals. Those 4 individuals may have varying degrees of experience, may have varying degrees of emotional intelligence. They may have varying degrees of knowledge, skills, and abilities. All of these things will create a potential level of risk. If they all were operating at the highest level of performance, both physically and mentally, had the highest level of skill set coupled with experience, there's a diminished level of risk that's associated with that. So think about your companies, think about mutual aid responses, think about staffing levels. What's the optimum level? Are we operating with 3-person or 4-persons or 5-person staff companies? And of those individuals at the company, what are the capabilities? How does that relate back to safety? How does it relate back to the availability of resources in a timely fashion on the fireground? And how does that equate back to perceived or actual defined risk on the fireground? So we talk about pulling these things together. There are 3 pieces here: construction, tactics, and safety. Building performance relates back to compartment, relates back to the company. Building performance, the compartment, resiliency. The compartment related to fire, related to the company, related to engagement. That's our tactical portion of it. And then we talk about safety, and again, a very generic global aspect. It's part of the company, part of the capabilities, part of the resources that equate back to risk. So these are important concepts that if you've never thought about them, again, that translates back into predictability performance. How does it get implemented? What are the error likely situations? Do we have miscues, misreading the building, misreading the fire, misreading priorities relative to severity, urgency, and gross, misreading time, misreading and applying inappropriate or incorrect tactics, misreading performance at the company, at the task, at the team, at the company, and at the alarm or box alarm basis. And again, misreading projected expected outcomes. It's a critical element when we talk about fireground operations. And again, I don't want to overload anyone too much here relative to the concept. If this is the first time you've been hearing some of these elements, again, it's all about simplifying our world. It's all about having mission-focused operations. It's the aspects of self, of team, of company, the box alarm. It's company fortitude, tactical resiliency. It's grit, it's rigor, it's aggressiveness, it's tactical discipline. It's motivated, dedicated, servant attitudes. It's the predictability performance as it relates back to the building and back to the fire. It's the tactical agility and mobility and having fast water. It goes back to having knowledge, skills, and ability, and also having literacy and being competent. It's safe to say, it's not the first time I've said it, but the American Fire Service, generally speaking, is functionally illiterate. We know enough to get by, but not nearly enough in certain applications and in certain areas to really put all of this together in such a critical standpoint. When we talk about human performance, and this is part of some things that are being developed, we talk about near miss reporting and having barriers, human performance barriers that can be put into place that help create a much more effective and efficient, safety-conscious work environment. It's having leadership, safety values and actions. It's understanding decision-making that supports, again, systematic, rigorous, and thorough operations. It's having respect for our work environment based upon the fireground variables. Trust permeates all operations of organizations, and having continuous learning opportunities that can be gained informally or formally on the fireground, but certainly when we talk about the formality of what we are gaining, learning opportunities at the kitchen table, within the drills at the firehouse, and certainly the in-service, the academy, and conference type settings. Clearly establishing the mission, clear and define risk parameters and expectations, clear accountability, maintaining knowledge, skills, and ability in accordance with roles, ranks, and responsibilities, maintaining an established degree of rigor, good communications, transparencies, clearly establishing risk parameters, having clear human performance expectations, 360-degree accountability from that particular standpoint. So lastly, when we talk about some of the other aspects here of human performance, and again, we've talked a lot about the considerations of building performance. We've talked a little bit in some of our previous shows about this level of learning and insights that we are gaining from R&D about the compartment, about the fire load package, and how that truly has variables regarding sustainability of fire flow. We do know that fast water, but we also have to have the efficiency and availability of effective applications of host streams of water, deployment of personnel, understanding the delta time. But again, it's understanding that we need to identify the problems, have process and practices, avoiding complacency, utilizing conservative bias, where again, decision-making practices emphasize prudent choices over those that are simply allowed, and any task action is determined to be safe in order to proceed rather than having an unsafe act, but also recognizing that initiative sometimes has to take place, and it's an important part when we talk about the initiative of a team member, of a company, to overcome barriers that are there, and hopefully relying on knowledge, skills, and ability, not sheer luck, but having some parameters that fall into place from a human performance standpoint that allow them to conduct that particular mission in a safe and effective manner with a positive outcome. Respect, trust, and values, again, permeate the organization. They permeate the firehouse that extends back to the fireground. So there are some things here that we get into that, again, the intent here was to connect some dots here, provide some insights on some things that just were recently talked about regarding building, regarding the fire, regarding human performance. I spent close to 10 years specifically at the company level, at the bargaining unit level, talking about human performance and really advocating and moving forward with traits that individuals would obtain, how that gets back into team effectiveness attributes. There's a lot of lessons and learnings. I mentioned crew resource management here a moment ago. Crew resource management was driven out or born out of the aviation industry at a time in which there were many human performance errors that led to significant property loss and civilian loss of life, primarily in the aviation industry. That is also paramount in three very distinct, when we talk about high risk environments: aviation, the military, and the nuclear power industry. Those three very distinct, and petroleum or nuclear, but nuclear in particular, very distinctive lessons and learnings and practices when we talk about developing the appropriate culture, developing appropriate team effectiveness, and implementing human performance elements. So for nothing else, we hope that we've planted a seed for some further conversations here. I didn't want to say this is going to be part one of a multiple part series, but we will talk more about, again, this correlation of building, compartment / fire, and the relationship of the company. We have been talking about it, but I think we'll put a little bit more focus in to align this further in some of our upcoming episodes here as we move forward in the remaining quarter of 2024 with our upcoming episodes here, both in October, November, and December. I think you'll look forward to hearing what we have to say here. I don't want to give out too much information here on what you might be able to expect on some of the upcoming episodes, but as always, we always entrust upon our listeners to tune in. We are always thankful and very humbled by your attendance, listening in, or now viewing our webcast, listening into our podcast. And again, our continued, my personal continued gratefulness to all of the leadership at Fire Engineering and fireengineering.com for allowing me to continue to have a voice in a very specific and so important area when we talk about building construction, fireground operations, and human performance. We truly need to have a higher degree of proficiencies. We really need to have both building and fireground literacy, or building and fire literacy, to the highest potential level possible. We've got to strive to that, and we look forward to our next episode to be able to talk about those in greater detail. So again, until next time, companies are in quarters and off the air. Stay safe, but keep in mind there's a job being worked somewhere in the streets doing what we do best, and that's being, and who we are, and that's being firefighters. So stay safe. Thank you very much for listening in on this episode of Buildings on Fire's, taking it to the streets, where we talked about and introduced a couple of insights on fireground performance related back to three distinctive interrelated areas of building performance: compartment performance regarding the fire and smoke conditions, but building conditions, compartment conditions, and reading the company. So again, three distinctive elements here that we have been talking about for the last 20 plus years, and we will continue to bring that information forward. So thanks again for listening in on this edition of Buildings on Fire's, taking it to the streets. I'm your host, Chris Naum, signing off. Stay safe, and we'll see you somewhere on the streets with a view from the building.
This podcast is brought to you by Flex 7 from TenCate Protective Fabrics. Flexible, comfortable, and powered with the strength of enforced technology. Flex 7 outer shell fabric is made to move. To learn more, visit tencatefabrics.com/Flex7.
For all your medication and narcotic tracking needs, check out the LogRX app, created by career fire and EMS professionals. That's LogRX.com.